Yeah, we're going to go and invite a guest and public participation. We do have a guest. Superintendent, you want to introduce him?
Yeah, we have Bob, or Robert Lewis, I guess, from PMA. We use PMA for our forecasting module and then some other financial stuff. And Howie Krause had kind of said, I guess, introduced me to Robert. Howie's our guy from our forecasting model. So Robert's going to go over some stuff with bonds. We've been discussing our bond situation, and he has a little presentation just to kind of go through on what some options are.
You should all have that in front of you. And thank you again for having me here tonight to speak to you. And as Mr. Hayes said, Mr. Doctor, I'm sorry. No, Mr. As Mr. Hayes stated, my colleague, Howie Krause, has had the pleasure to work with you at PMA Financial Network, and more recently that business has migrated over Forecast 5. I specifically work for a sister company, PMA Securities. It's the business under which we conduct our financial advisory work on the issuance of municipal bonds. So Mr. Hayes invited me here tonight to speak to you about your current situation on your bonds, and also to give you an overview of how the school bond process works in Illinois. So my goal is to help educate you tonight. So if you have some questions as I go through it or need me to repeat something, please don't hesitate and ask me to do it, because that's my objective. So if something's not making sense, just stop me and I can go over it again. So the very first section of the presentation is a market update. I'm often asked, how are interest rates doing? Well, interest rates are interesting in that, there's not just one interest rate you can look at. You got to look at a variety of different interest rates, because interest rates can be different on the first couple years than they are in the middle years and in later years, because bonds can be sold for a term of 1 to 20 years. So you can't just ask what are interest rates doing and give you one answer, because it depends on which years you're looking at. So the chart you have before you is called the MMD. This is an index for municipal bonds. It's like the Dow Jones Industrials or the S&P 500. What that is for the equity markets. This is what we look at every day to track trends in the municipal bond market. And I've given you the data back in 2013, so you can see recent trends and how the markets have moved. If you go back to 1990, which we do have a data file that goes back that far, you'll see that we're still near historically low interest rates, although we typically have a lot of variation over periods of time caused by dramatic movement, or dramatic news announcements, if you will. Like right here, that big precipitous increase that was right around the presidential election was a surprise to the markets. And the surprise was one that caused investors to think interest rates across the curve could shoot up for a variety of different reasons. Tax law reform, more economic activity, more borrowing. What's happened, those rates have come down since then, because what we've seen out of Washington is much of what we've seen out of Springfield. Not much gets done. And so all the reforms that they were concerned about, nothing's really happened. And a lot of the rates came back down when they failed to repeal Obamacare, because the consensus was, well, if they can't do that, what will they be able to agree upon? So, and the other factor that's been a big influence in the municipal bond market recently, you can see by the blue line. That's the one-year rate. And you notice it's been going up quite a bit, and that's due to the Federal Reserve raising the Fed funds rate. And there's a common misnomer when we look at bonds that, the Fed's going to raise rates, so all interest rates are going to go up across the board. And that is not true. Just because the Fed raises the Fed funds rate, you see that impact on the earlier rates, doesn't necessarily mean the longer rates are going to go up just because the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates. If all of you had economics courses, you probably remember that monetary policy discussion that the Federal Reserve controls interest rates. So that's not really all 100% correct. There's a lot of factors that impact the municipal bond market. So hopefully now you have a good snapshot of where we're at as it relates to the municipal bonds. Now I want to turn my attention to how school districts go about borrowing bonds, issuing debt in the municipal market in the state of Illinois. We talk about the municipal bond market like there's one market across the United States, but really there's 50 different municipal bond markets, all of which have different characteristics to them based off the legal framework, also what's the perception of the markets. Unfortunately, right now, I know you can see Kentucky right across the river, but because your last name's Illinois, you have a stigma associated with you if you ever go to sell bonds in Illinois, because a lot of investors have said, we don't want anything to do with anything in this state because people in this state can't figure out what they want to do. Which unfortunately is not you, it's our representatives, our governor.
Right.
And that has unfortunately cast a stigma on everybody in the state, and that is worse the longer your bond issue is and the lower your underlying credit rating is. So in Illinois, the school code prescribes very specific ways in which you can obtain debt. You can't just go to the bank and sign a promissory note like you might as a business. And there's certain types of governments that can do that, namely home rule cities, which are cities generally that are over 25,000 in population. Almost every other unit of government in the state has to borrow through prescribed methods, which I will describe on this page. The first is through a general obligation building bond, and those are authorized via referendum. You currently don't have any building bonds outstanding. But if you had to build a new building, oftentimes those are done as referendum bonds, because that referendum not only gives you permission to issue the bonds, it also gives you permission to build the building. That's a special provision in the school code. Unlike any other type of government can go out and build a new city hall, a new public works garage, a new park district civic center, without specifically asking for that, as long as they have funding to provide for it. Unlike schools, if your students are going to be housed in the building, you have to ask permission to build the building, in addition to issuing the bond. So it's a rather unique feature. The next type of bond is a non-referendum general obligation bond. And as the name describes, those are bonds that schools can issue without having to go to referendum. Now there's limitations on how you can issue those bonds, which we'll describe in a little more detail in the next couple slides. So these first two types, that word general obligation, or GO, has meaning for both you and your investors. For you, it means you're going to levy a separate property tax to pay the principal and interest on those bonds. So you levy property taxes, although I was just informed that you haven't been able to do so far this year, but usually from every year you levy and extend property taxes, and there's a separate tax just to pay these bonds. And you have an education fund tax, an O&M, and a transportation tax. Those are used to pay operating expenditures. This tax only pays the bonds, which means it's not going to impact your operating side, but it also means from an investor's perspective that if something goes awry in the operating side, like you don't get school funding, for instance, there's still a separate property tax that's going to pay the bonds even if the operating side's not doing well. So it has meaning for both you and your investors. The other borrowing mechanisms, alternate bonds, debtor lease certificates, capital leases, those are all paid from your operating funds. There's not a separate tax to pay them. So if you do one of these three mechanisms, you have to make sure that you can afford to make that payment and still pay your teachers and still maintain your buildings and all the other things you might need to do as a school district. A lot of school districts have capital leases for copiers, buses, computers, and they're rather small, usually paying back over a 2 to 5 year term. Alternate bonds and debtor lease certificates, usually for bigger projects, and oftentimes they're not. I don't see a lot of school districts using those because the concern is over time you may not be able to afford to pay them out of your operating budget. And then the last one are tax anticipation warrants. And so everything I've talked about so far is for long-term capital projects like safety needs, building needs. Tax anticipation warrants are for cash flow, which you may or may not need to do depending on this property tax situation and the state. What's going on at the state right now is occurring right now. If you heard, they voted down the compromise bill,
Right.
and then they just brought up Senate Bill 1's repeal, and they just voted that down. And I was following along Capitol Facts, that's where I came up here, and then the thought is they're going to bring back the bill that they voted down a couple of hours ago in a new form.
They just did.
They-
It passed.
Oh, it passed.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That's
So
why you were talking, I'm sorry.
yeah, it's a roller coaster in school funding. So
Do we
hopefully,
have a bill budget now?
Well, no, not yet.
yeah, because now the Senate have to pass that and the governor have to sign it.
Right.
So,
Oh, my goodness.
so that's the overview of how school districts borrow. That's all under the school code. Now, for a moment, we have to turn our attention to another part of Illinois law, the PTEL, the tax cap. you're in a county that is subject to tax caps. So there are limitations on how you can go about issuing non-referendum school bonds. That limitation is called the debt service extension base. And I have a typo here on this slide, just noticed. 1994 is not the year tax caps came into Massac County. I can't remember the exact year, but it was years after. 1994 is when tax caps first came into being.
Somewhere around 2000,
2000 or 2001, it was right.
Yeah, okay, so right around there, when your county voted in tax caps, whatever you're levying for in that year for your non-referendum bonds became something called your debt service extension base. So it's a limitation on the annual payment you can have your non-referendum bonds. So now you have a limit on how much you can issue in non-referendum school bonds. And the analogy I oftentimes use for this is similar to what we as individuals, the first time you go to buy a home, the information you review to determine how big of a home you can buy begins with, what can I afford in my budget as a monthly home payment? And let's just say that's $500. So if that's what you can afford in your budget for your mortgage payment, you look at a $500 monthly payment, you can go out 30 years, what are interest rates today, and with that information you can determine how big of a home you can buy. If interest rates go up, you have to buy a smaller home. If interest rates go down, you can buy a larger home. If you don't want to go out 30 years, you only want to go out 20 years, well, you have to buy a smaller home. So that's what essentially your debt service extension base is. The larger your debt service extension base is, the more you can borrow. So it's a limit on the annual levy. So when tax caps first came in, the original extension base was right around $640,000. A few years ago in 2009, that was tied to CPI. And so that has increased to $735,324. And you can see this graphically on the next slide, what this looks like. So the red line represents your current debt service extension base, and then the dashed line represents that base growing at 1.5% per year. We've made an assumption at CPI. CPI is lower than that, the slope of that line will be lower. CPI is higher than that, the slope will be higher. And you notice the blue bars represent your current debt payments. So they fit right below your debt service extension base. So you're levying right up to your max. But you notice those blue bars continue to increase. Because when those bonds were sold, they were sold under the assumption that your DSEB would grow over time. Okay? So if it doesn't grow over time, well then you'd have to make up the difference between the cap of the red line and the blue bar from your operating funds. So you can only, again, levy up to the red line. Anything above that red line, you have to cover from your pot of funds that you use for everything else. Everybody follow me up to now?
Right. Is it, can I stop you for a second?
Sure.
One of the reasons that goes up too is that the longer the years are out in the bonds, those interest rates are going to be higher because those people are getting their money. It's taking longer for them to get their money back, right? So
well, yeah, you're somewhat correct, but we structure the principal so it will fit under that line. Right. So even though the people later you're getting a higher interest rate, we should be able to structure the principal so it fits underneath it. You notice we go out all the way to 2036 because you can go out, school code says you can go out 20 years on a bond issue. So you know as individuals, we can go out 30 years. As a unit of government, the law only lets you go out 20 years on your general obligation bonds. So if you imagine this, then this is like a 20-year box. Your box is about $750,000 high, and you go out 20 years, and you can fill that box all at one time. You can go out 20 years. The problem is you've tied your hands. What are you going to do 5 years from now if you have another capital need? So you're really using this in an ideal way, in my opinion. You don't want to go out and use it all at one time, because if you use it all at one time, you pay a lot of interest because you're doing a 20-year bond issue. If you ever look at your mortgage statement, do that 30-year mortgage the first time, it tells you how much you're going to pay back in interest. Yeah. It's a lot more than you're borrowing initially. So the shorter you're able to keep the financing, the more bang for your buck you'll get. And also, a few years from now, when you have another capital need, you'll be able to tap into this and address it at that time. Okay. So, as a refresher really quick, when we talked about general obligation bonds, the alternate bonds, and debt certificates, those are school code concepts. Then we talked about the tax cap. Now we're turning our attention back to the school code on page 8. Because just because you have a non-referendum DSEB, debt service extension base, doesn't mean that you can just go out and sell a DSEB bond. Right? It's a common misnomer. I'll hear a school district say, oh yeah, we're going to go out and sell DSEB bonds. Well, there really is no such thing as a DSEB bond. What you're doing is you're issuing one of 4 types of non-referendum bonds listed on page 8, and then you're going to pay it back subject to the constraint of your DSEB. So there's 4 different types of non-referendum school bonds, and they're listed in the frequency in which they're utilized. The first type is a working cash bond, and those bonds can be used for capital projects or for operating capital. If it's used for a capital project, you sell the working cash bond, and the proceeds of that working cash bond are deposited into your working cash fund at closing, and then you abate those funds to your O&M fund. An abatement is just a fancy way to say a permanent transfer to your O&M fund, and then it's transferred into your capital projects fund. The reason why it doesn't go directly to the capital projects fund is twofold. Some capital expenditures are made out of the O&M fund, and secondly, legally, if you examine the school code, you won't find the word capital projects fund in the school code. You find operations maintenance fund, you find transportation fund, you find education fund. You don't find the words capital projects fund. Capital projects fund is an accounting concept created by ISB. So when you do a legal transfer to the O&M abatement, you have to do it to the O&M fund, and then legally the capital projects fund is seen as a subset of the operations and maintenance fund. If you need to do it for operating capital, meaning you actually keep it in your operating funds for cash flow purposes, those funds are less restrictive and are more restrictive on how you can issue the bonds, and also instead of abating to the O&M fund, you may abate it to the education fund. So why would a school district issue a working cash fund for operational purposes? One, you may be in a situation where you've had deficits for several years in a row, so you've drained your liquidity, and now you need to get more fund balance to manage your cash flow instead of issuing tax anticipation warrants. I have a couple of clients that have unfortunately gotten in a situation where they had a significant devaluation in their tax base because a power plant left. And it left them really short on their operating funds, and they couldn't get the voters to support an education fund tax rate increase. So they've gone to issuing a working cash bond every year to supplement their operating funds. Now, it's not an ideal situation, but that's the only thing that they could do to continue to educate their students. The next type of bond is a life safety bond. Life safety bond can only be used for a capital project, and a very specific capital project, a life safety project. The way you go about issuing a life safety bond is you have to have your architects go through the process of creating a life safety survey, send that to Springfield, and then they'll certify the life safety projects and then give you a health code violation, if you will. And that gives you authority to issue a life safety bond. You can't, and your architects can't just say, this roof replacement, this parking lot replacement, that's a life safety project, and go out and sell life safety bonds. You have to have that approval back from Springfield in order to do that. So if you get a $2 million approval, you can issue a $2 million life safety bond. You can't issue 2.5 or anything above that. You can only do $2 million. A funding bond is used to pay a claim or liability. That's an example I provide there is like a land contract. So I had one client enter into a contract to buy a piece of land. That contract functioned as a claim. It was a liability. It's something they had to pay legally. They signed the contract. But they issued a funding bond to pay off that contract, and then they could pay it from a separate bond issue. And then lastly, there's a tort bond. It's pretty self-explanatory. I've never done a tort bond, so they're obviously not issued very often. All 4 of those bonds require a step called a Bond Issue Notification Act hearing, or BINA hearing. It's like your budget hearing or your tax levy hearing if you have to do one for truth in taxation. And 2 of those bonds, the working cash bond and the funding bond, also require the additional step of a 30-day petition process. So before you can issue those bonds, you have to go, the board passes a notice of intent resolution for example, to issue working cash bonds in an amount not to exceed $2 million. That's published in a local paper. 30 days from that publication date, if 10% or more of your registered voters sign the petition, it has to go to referendum in order for you to issue the bonds. And in that case, it becomes a referendum bond. It's no longer a non-referendum bond if you choose to proceed. Life safety bonds don't have that requirement. And I'm oftentimes asked, why don't life safety bonds have that requirement too? And I've never asked anybody who would know the legislative history, but I imagine it's because the state has agreed that these are vitally important projects that need to be accomplished, so they don't want to have that go through that process. They want you to finance them and take care of those needs. And if you don't have the operating funds to do it, well, then you have to issue bonds. Any question then on the framework about how you go about issuing bonds in Illinois? Okay. Now let's take a moment to look at your outstanding debt portfolio. This sheet here is one of our main worksheets we put together. It shows you your projected debt capacity, and it shows you how it changes over time. So if you look at the first set of numbers, I begin with the amount of principal you have outstanding at the beginning of this current fiscal year 18. You have $7 million outstanding. And then you make principal payments throughout the year. You're actually going to pay down a pretty significant payment. This debt certificate was was a qualified zone academy bond. And you pay that off this year. You've been setting aside funds every year in a sinking fund to pay this off. This is the year you pay it off, so it'll be gone. But after that, you have two non-referendum general obligation bonds that are payable from your debt service extension base, which I'll show you in a little more detail how that works on a subsequent slide. So you subtract all that principal at the end of the period, you have about $3.4 million of principal outstanding. So when I take your equalized assessed value, and right now I still have to use your 2015 equalized assessed value because of the litigation, they haven't released what your 2016 EAV would be. So I'm still using the 2015 EAV. So I take that and multiply it by 13.8%, you get $19 million. Is the maximum amount of principal you can have outstanding. It's not principal and interest, it's just principal. Subtract from that $3.4 million, you have remaining net margin of $15.7 million. So you could sell bonds up to $15.7 million, either referendum bonds or non-referendum bonds, without having to get any sort of legislative relief. There's a few school districts that occasionally have a project that's larger than their legal debt margin, and what they've done is gone to the General Assembly and sought relief from that margin so they can build their project that they need to do. So even if the voters, let's say the voters approved you to do a $20 million bond issue, you legally could not do it because your limit's $15.7 million. Okay? And over time, that number will change as your EAV changes. We held it constant, your EAV constant through here, but if your EAV grows, that number will get larger. Conversely, it also gets larger as you pay down principal. This next slide shows you the debt service. Debt services are a way we say principal and interest, okay? And just for the 2011-2015 bonds, because that QZAB that you're going to pay off isn't payable from your extension base. It's payable from your operating funds, in fact. So I take your debt service. If I look at the yellow row, that year, your 2011 bonds, these are the payments you made last fiscal year. Had a payment of $593,000. Your 2015 bonds had a payment of $119,000 for a total of $713,695. That fit within your debt service extension base constraint of $715,000. So the difference between your debt service extension base, and again, I apologize, that year's not the year that you passed it. But I take that number, subtract the $713,000, your remaining margin's $1,499. So you're right at your margin. Now we assume that extension base continues to grow. Actually, we know the actual extension base for levy year 16, levy year 17, because it's tied to the CPIs that came out in January of each year. After levy year 17, we've assumed it increases by 1.5% per year. So you'll have positive remaining margin as long as your debt service extension base grows. If it's held constant, you actually will be slightly negative. Like if you remember that graph I showed you where you're slightly above the solid line, but you're below the dashed line. If you stay at the solid line, you'll have to make up that difference from your operating fund. And then your tax rate for your debt comes out at the far right column right around 50 cents. per $100 of equalized assessed valuation. So you can see in 5 years' time, this matches your graph, or actually, yeah, 5 years' time, all your non-referendum bonds will be gone. And at that time, if you need to borrow, you can do so and fit it into your debt service extension base. If you need to borrow sooner than this, oftentimes boards will think, well, what if we have a need in 3 years? We can't do anything. We can't address it. Well, there's ways to manage the constraint. One, you can refinance some of the outstanding bonds to lower the payment by stretching out the payment by a year or so. Or if you could use some of your operating funds if you had to for a couple of years to make the interest payments on a new bond issue. So ideally, you don't sell new bonds until you get to the end, but if you got in a pinch, you need to address some life safety needs, you could do so prior to that final year of payment. The next slide shows you the principal on your outstanding bonds by series. So you have the debt certificates, which you'll be paying off here soon. You've been setting aside about $153,000 annually from your operating fund. So actually, you'll make that last payment this year, which is good because that means next year you no longer have to pay that $152,000 into your sinking fund. That frees that money up for your operating funds. Then you have the 2011 bonds. Those became callable on 12/1/16. Now, you may be wondering, what does that mean they became callable? Oftentimes when we talk about refinancing municipal bonds, we go back to that same analogy of talking about a home mortgage. There's a big difference, though, between a home mortgage and a municipal bond. A municipal bond, or actually, let me start with the home mortgage. If you get a home mortgage, 3 or 4 years, you can refinance that home mortgage if you want to. You can refinance it in 7 years. You can actually refinance it in 6 months if you wanted to. I'm not sure if it makes sense to do that, but you could. You can refinance it any time you want. Essentially, it's callable any time, meaning you can pay off the old one and issue a new mortgage. Municipal bonds have a period of time in which you cannot pay them off or refinance them until you get to the call date. Now, there's ways to do stuff beforehand, but I won't get into them because it's not really applicable to you because you're past your call dates. So those became callable on 12/1/16, which means you can either pay those off or you can issue a new bond at perhaps a lower interest rate and generate some debt service savings. And a little later in the presentation, I'll show you what some potential savings could be for that 2011 bond issue. The 2015 series is a bond issue that is callable at any time. So you can refinance that and pay it off at any time. You have full flexibility.
Those are the ones we bought from ourselves.
Those are the ones you bought for yourself. And we'll talk about that in great detail here in a moment. So a little bit more detail on the 2011 bonds. What was the original purpose? Those bonds refinanced a 2000 series for debt service savings back in 2011. Those were issued as tax-exempt bonds. This concept of tax exemption is really important because it's a subsidy that is provided to local units of government by the federal government. Let me go back to the home mortgage analogy again. This is a loose parallel, but not exactly the same. With our home mortgages, you're able to deduct the interest you pay on your taxes, and that provides you a benefit on your mortgage. It essentially lowers your effective interest rate. And the same thing happens a little differently on municipal bonds. If your bond is a capital project, meaning it's going to finance roofs or parking lots or additions, you can issue those bonds as tax exempt, meaning the investors who buy your bonds don't have to pay taxes on the interest that you pay to them. Consequently, they're willing to buy them from you at a lower interest rate, which benefits you as the school district and indirectly to your taxpayers. Your taxpayers can pay back the bonds at a lower interest rates than if you sold them taxable. The average interest rate on those 2011 bonds is 4%, which is higher than, if you remember that chart at the beginning, it's higher than the index. The 2015 bonds were also issued to currently refund a prior bond issue. You have $2 million of which are callable at any time. You have a payment on those due as early as December 1st of 17. The 2015 bonds were issued as taxable bonds. The average interest rate on those bonds was 2.81%. And as Mr. Hayes already mentioned, those bonds you purchased yourself as an investment in your operating funds. So these are bonds that could have been issued as tax exempt if they're sold to the public, but because you buy them yourself, the IRS won't allow you to issue them as tax exempt because, in their opinion, if you have the funds to buy your own bond, you can't sell it as tax exempt. Because they don't want over issuance. Because imagine if the IRS, you want as few tax exempt bonds as possible, because every single tax exempt bond that's sold has tax exempt interest, which means they're not collecting taxes on it. Now, you as a municipal unit of government wouldn't pay taxes anyhow as an investor, so it's not really consequential to you. Yes.
Now, when they were originally issued, though, before we did that, were they non-taxable originally?
Yes. So the bonds that we refinanced were tax-exempt bonds. So by buying them yourself, you made the decision to buy them as taxable bonds. Okay.
So if we refinance them, anyone that buys them has to pay taxes on the interest.
Right. Because you, and that's one thing I've ran by counsel, the attorneys on the deal, that because you bought them and held them, from the IRS's perspective, the original bonds were extinguished. So you can't go back and now sell tax-exempt refunding bonds because from the IRS perspective, it's a brand new bond issue. And you're not financing a capital project this time around. You're paying off a bond that doesn't exist from their perspective. So unfortunately, you have to issue the new bonds as taxable if you were to refinance them, which means you don't get as low of an interest rate as possible in the public market. One thing I should point out on this slide, if you go back to here, because it's important as we discuss your options as it relates to the 15 bonds. Because when we get to the 15 bonds, one of the options you do have is to just keep the bonds, keep this position. Don't do anything, just keep holding this bond. The problem you have from a liquidity standpoint is the principal you're paying off on this bond issue is rather small until you get to year 4. So although when you pay the principal back to yourself, like this year, you'll gain $66,000 of principal liquidity back, liquid funds that you can use for cash flow purposes. That's not a lot of money relative to the size of this bond issue. And the same thing with the year after that and the year after that. Okay, so keep that in mind. How it's not like this issue where you're paying back $530,000 each year. If you own that bond issue, you'd be adding a lot of liquidity to your coffers each year, as opposed to this. So when you own your own bond, your fund balance really doesn't change. When you look at your audit, you see your fund balance. The problem is the composition of fund balance between liquid assets, because you have to manage cash flow. You get your funds throughout the year in uneven chunks. Your property taxes come in 2 big chunks generally. School money should come throughout the year in fairly uniform amounts. So that's the problem with owning this bond, is you don't have that money available to help you during those tight cash flow times. So the next slide looks at your options then. What can you do with the position that you currently own in the 2015 bonds? You can do nothing. You can continue to own the 2015 bonds, paying interest to yourself from the tax levy when you collect it at a rate of 2.81%. And then if you have a cash flow need, you go out and do tax anticipation warrants. Those are back on that early slide where I talked about different types of borrowing. Tax anticipation warrants are for cash flow. And so let's say for a 3 or 4 month period, you need some additional liquidity because either the state's not paying you or this lawsuit prevents you from collecting property taxes. So for that 3 months, you borrow, I'm just using hypothetical numbers here. I don't know if this is the right number or not. We haven't had any discussions. You borrow $500,000. You have to pay interest to the bank that buys that TAW, let's say 2 or 3 or 4 months, and you may have to pay some transaction fees associated with it. But you maintain that investment and manage your cash flow by doing that every year until you need your liquidity. The next option is to sell the 2015 bonds to another investor. another investor could be another local unit of government, perhaps. It could be a bank. But your pool of investors are limited because of the nature of this type of bond. You can't sell it to individuals, for instance. Because this bond is what we would characterize as being illiquid. It's got some characteristics that make it difficult to sell other than to other sophisticated types of investors.
Could it be to a hospital, not for profit?
It depends on whether that's considered a sophisticated investor, which means to be considered a sophisticated investor would have to have $50 million in assets or more, generally speaking. So what makes it illiquid? It's got unusual bond denominations. Usually, municipal bond issues are sold in denominations of $5,000. So if you go to buy a municipal bond in the market, you have to buy a minimum denomination of $5,000 generally. And that makes it more liquid because that's what people are used to buying and selling. Yours are, I believe, in $100 or $1,000 denominations. Actually, dollar denominations. If you go back to slide, well, actually, yeah, no, they're in $100 denominations. If you look at slide 12. So it's an unusual denomination. There's no rating on these bonds. So a potential investor may want you to pay for a rating in order to get them to buy them.
So you're saying the $100 bond is irrational, not normal?
It's not a normal bond denomination. It doesn't make it impossible to sell. I'm just saying that makes it a little more difficult, especially when you take it into consider, all three of these things. There's no QSIP numbers. What's a QSIP number? That's like a social security number for a bond. So when you trade bonds, investors want QSIP numbers assigned to them. Now you can always get QSIP numbers assigned to them, right, but that's another expense. And because this was done as a direct placement to yourself, to find another investor, you may need to engage a placement agent. A placement agent is a broker-dealer. PMA is a broker-dealer, but we don't function in a placement agent capacity. We function as a municipal advisor, what does that mean? Under the regulatory rules, we only represent your interest. We have a fiduciary duty to you, and the rules prohibit us as a financial advisor to negotiate with potential investors because they see that as a conflict of interest. If we have a fiduciary duty, we can't also represent the interests of investors because they have the opposite desire of you. If you sell the bond, you want to sell at the highest price possible. Another investor wants to buy it at the lowest price possible. So I can't serve two masters, if you will, as a fiduciary. A broker-dealer acting as a placement agent has a fair dealing requirement under the regulations, which means they can be a go-between. They have to treat each party fairly, but they don't have a fiduciary duty, which is the highest standard. So a placement agent can step in and help to identify another purchaser. We've estimated, this is a loose estimate looking at where some other bonds have sold in the market. Ultimately, it would take dialogue with potential investors to see where they're interested at. And so we estimated at the current market that if you sold the bond, you might lose about $15,000 net of some estimated costs to do that. And I have those costs detailed on a more detailed slide. I could be wrong in the estimate of the market. You might be able to actually sell it at a profit. But it's right there around break even. It's going to be probably give or take. Maybe a little loss, maybe a little gain if you sold the bond. And you can always explore it and see what you might get. And because when you engage people on these transactions, whether it's me as a financial advisor or Chapman & Cutler or some other bond counsel or a placement agent, we always work on the where we only get paid if something happens. So if you explore this and try to sell it, and at the end of the day you find out it's going to be a loss, we'd rather just keep it, you're not out a dime for doing that analysis. It's only if you would follow through and go ahead and sell it. What the benefit of selling to another investor is it restores you to liquidity. So now you would have roughly $2 million in your operating funds. You can go out and invest it like in bank CDs or some sort of mutual or money market fund, either through ISLAF or some fund like that, where it's readily available for you for cash flow purposes. Another option is to refund the 2015 bonds with a new bond issue. So instead of trying to find a buyer for your bonds, of the current bond issue, you're going to issue a brand new bond issue, pay off yourself, and then those bonds can be sold to the public because they can be set up with QSIP numbers, they can be set up with normal denominations, they can be set up with a rating. Unfortunately, the denomination problem can't be fixed unless you issue new bonds. The other two problems, the rating and the QSIPs, you could do that with your current bond issue, but you can't change the denominations. The only way to change the denomination is to pay it off and start from scratch. And as I mentioned, you cannot issue it on a tax-exempt basis, unfortunately. So if you do decide to refund it, you'll have to sell as a taxable bond, which will reduce the value of the refunding. We calculated that if you were to issue a refunding bond, you probably would lose about $35,000 in doing that. So that's a larger loss than if you sold the bonds, current bonds, to another investor. And again, these are just estimates, our best estimates. You can explore both options and pull the plug. The only cost you ever incur on a transaction prior to actually closing is the rating fee. But you wouldn't incur the rating fee unless you knew. That's like one of the last things you do on the path of issuing a new bond. So if you got that far, you're fairly certain you're going to do it. So incurring the fee shouldn't be a problem at that point. And
what is your percentage on a fee like that?
If you sold this bond issue, we would probably charge, if you did a bond issue, we'd probably charge about $12,000, $12,500, somewhere in that range, to act as financial advisor on the transaction. Now, we're not the only vendor. You have to pay bond counsel, rating fee, underwriter. We estimate those fees at about 2% of the, so probably around $40,000 to $45,000 all-in fees. And that's why this costs more to actually refund the bonds than to sell the bonds. It's primarily the cost of issuance. You probably get a better interest rate, a better price issuing the new bonds than reselling your old bonds because the new bonds be more liquid, but you're going to have more cost of issuance doing a new bond. That's why I would, if you want to get out of this position, the first thing I would ask a team of finance professionals you're working with is explore selling to someone else, because that would be the cheaper option than issuing the new bonds. Okay?
How long would that take? About a week, 2 weeks, or something like that? What's the time limit on something like that?
Probably take 4 to 5 weeks, probably, because we would have to put together, because potential investors are going to want to know things about your credit. You're not going to have a credit rating on that bond, more than likely. We put together what's called a term sheet. And that term sheet would describe your tax base, your finances, anything you would want to know about your district in order to buy this bond. So even though you're going to sophisticated investors like banks, and there's a lot of units of government that are buying these directly too. So they understand school districts. And a lot of times it might even be another school district buying it. A lot of school districts in the suburban area by Chicago, they're buying bonds like this because they're getting a better return than if they went out and bought bank CDs. But they have a much bigger. These sometimes these are a bigger buyer. A big buyer of these municipal bonds are township treasurers in Cook County. What happens in Cook County is a township will have underneath it several school districts, and they'll pool all those funds together. So they have millions and millions and millions of dollars to invest, and they buy a lot of these bonds directly. So that could be a potential buyer of your bond, perhaps. But I can't make that introduction.
Right.
What this analysis doesn't include is the potential benefit of avoiding any TAWs. So if you get in a situation where you have to issue TAWs and you have to pay interest to the bank on those, you have to pay some fees to do TAWs, that would be a benefit if you eliminate the need to have to do TAWs. Maybe you never have to do those to begin with. So that's why I didn't want to add that into the analysis. So this next slide provides the detail on the how we came up with the potential loss if you sold your bonds. So your bonds right here, this is bond math. Okay, I don't want to get into the real esoteric nature of this, but just to give you a brief idea. Here's the principal payments each year. This is the interest rate assigned to each principal payment. As Mr. Hayes had said earlier, each principal payment has a different interest rate assigned to it. And then when you pay interest, you're paying an interest payment on each one of those maturities. We call these bond maturities. Well, we looked at these rates on each maturity and said, well, how do those rates compare to the current rates in the market for a 1-year maturity, a 2-year maturity? And if your rate is higher than the current rate, you would sell that maturity at a premium. So for that $71,000 maturity, an investor might pay you as much as $72,000 for it. So you're getting a little bit of a premium on that one. And then when you get to the lower ones, the rate is a little, current rate in our estimate, looking at some recent sales, is a little higher than the rate you're paying. So you have to sell it at a slight discount to an investor. So that's how we come up with a purchase price, is we're just looking at how your bond compares to other bonds in the market. So again, aggregate purchase price of $194,630. So the purchase price less the sales, about so it's almost a wash on selling it. And the loss is on the cost. I estimate a placement agent might be around $7,800. On a direct plate, if you were to sell this, our services, I estimate at $4,800. So it's less than the bond issue because we have to do more work if you go to do a bond issue. And then you have a paying agent bond registrar you might have to assign, because right now you're the paying agent bond registrar. Usually there's a third-party paying agent bond registrar. And then the QSIP cost. So your total cost would be $13,000. That's where I come up with the net loss. You may avoid, if you want, some of these costs by just going to your local banks yourself. There's nothing that precludes you from going to your local bank and saying, hey, you want to buy this bond from us? You can eliminate the placement agent, for instance. And you can negotiate on the rate yourself. If the bank's not interested or the terms aren't favorable, that's when you may want to widen out to look at a bigger environment and engage other parties to help you in that process. The next slide shows you our estimate of if you were to refinance it with a brand new bond. So this column here is our estimate. If you went out and sold a brand new bond issue, this is our estimate of what the payback would be. This is what you're currently paying on these bonds. So the difference between those two cash flows is that estimated loss I had earlier, about $39,000. So we factored into this column right here, the cost of issuance is factored into the new bond issue, which again I estimated, I can't remember the exact number, it's like $45,000. But that's factored into this column. Okay? The next slide, so for a moment we're turning our attention away from the 2015 bonds to look at your 2011 bonds. That was a bond issue that had a 4% interest rate on it. And we estimate if you sold a refunding bond for those, you could refinance those and save about $35,000 as a refunding bond. So that could, by doing that simultaneously with what you do on the 15 bonds, that could help offset any loss on the 15 bonds by doing them at the same time. Any questions on what I presented, either at the beginning on the school bond framework or your options as it relates to the 2015 bonds?
I think when we ended up buying our own bonds, it was kind of presented that it was going to save money somehow. And actually, we're still levying for the payments of those bonds, so that didn't change.
Right.
We did save a little bit, a couple points in the interest rate, I think, by refinancing those and buying them ourselves.
Well, I would, if you indulge me for a moment, in a simplistic analysis, it looks like you're saving because if you look, but it's really, I think it's a little bit misleading and sometimes how this buy your whole bonds is presented, because those liquid funds that you had to buy your own bonds were probably invested in something short term, 1 year or less. And at the time, you maybe were making, 0.5%, 0.75%. And then you're looking, well, we can buy our own bonds and make 2.8%. Look at what we're gaining. We're gaining over 200 basis points, over 2%. Well, the problem in that analysis is you've made that, by buying your own bond in that situation, you've made a decision to change the duration of your investment portfolio for the school district. You've gone from having a relatively short duration portfolio to a long duration portfolio, hence why you don't have a lot of liquidity for cash flow purposes. And you could have done that without buying your own bonds. You could have said, hey, I don't like these liquid funds, we don't need to be as liquid, I'm going to go out and buy some other school district's 5 or 6 year bond and make some percentage rate. So that's why I'm saying it's not exactly a gain by buying your own bonds, because you could have bought another investment and got the same or higher return. And that higher investment, although your bonds were issued as taxable, they may have been set at a tax-exempt rate, okay? Which means you could have gone out and bought a taxable investment. Let's say you could have gone out and bought another investment that was taxable at 3%, instead of buying your own bonds at 2.8%. So you had other options at the time. And when you choose to sell your bonds as tax, so either you're giving up something on the investment side because you could have gotten a higher return on some other bond that also lengthened your duration, but maybe you set that rate at what a taxable rate would be, so you didn't give up anything on the investment side. Well, then that means you could have set the interest rate at, you could have sold in the public market at a tax-exempt rate and had a lower rate on the bonds had you not bought them yourself. So something was given up. It's the equivalent of not taking the homeowner's exemption. When you have the ability to sell tax-exempt bonds, you could have sold at a lower interest rate and conversely bought someone else's bonds and invested at a taxable rate. So there's a give up there. But it's oftentimes presented as you're currently investing at 50 basis points, you buy your own bond and invest at 2.8%. But I think that analysis is a little incomplete.
It's a little misleading. And in the end, we didn't save taxpayers any.
No, the taxpayers didn't save any money.
Well, I think that was kind of part of the presentation. Do you ever recommend districts buy their own bonds?
I do it in very limited circumstances. Let me describe those circumstances. I've a couple clients who they have a debt service extension base and issue a 1 or 2 year bond for capital projects. And remember when I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, there's not just one interest rate. Right. There's multiple interest rates. Well, when you get close to a 1 or 2 year bond, the difference between a taxable and tax-exempt interest rate is very, very narrow. So you go further up the curve, that gap widens. So my 2 clients who bought their own bonds for a 1 or 2 year duration, the difference between taxable and tax-exempt rates was very narrow there. So they weren't giving up much. So then we looked at, okay, is there a difference in the cost of issuance, which you pay us if you buy the bonds yourself versus if I go out and do a public sale and get a rating and everything else? Because when you save on cost of issuance, or when you pay cost of issuance, when you pay more cost of issuance, it's better that it's a longer bond because you amortize those over more years. So you might pay more money, but it's incrementally spread over a longer term. If I'm paying more cost of issuance on a 1 or 2 year bond, I got to pay all that at one time. I got to absorb that full impact. So if I can avoid cost of issuance on a 1 or 2 year bond, a lot of times it benefits that district. So we look at those two things. The difference between the 2 rates was narrow. The cost of issuance savings was significant. We didn't have a rating. We didn't have an underwriter. I charged like half the fee. Legal fees were less.
So it's like if you sold us our own bonds, your fee would have been a lot less.
Yes. Yeah, because I don't have to prepare an official statement. I don't have to take you through a rating process. It's a lot less work for me if you buy your own bonds.
Very interesting.
And well, it goes back to the fiduciary duty. I can't charge you the same fee for different work. And just to finish that analogy I was talking about, so that client of mine that bought their own 1 year bond, we looked at, okay, what are you currently invested in? They were, at the time, it was like 0.35% was what their liquid investment rate was. And now remember, it's on 1 or 2 year bonds, so they're not really changing the liquidity profile. They're going from a money market fund to a 1 year bond, so it is a little less liquid, but not that much. The rate that we went to a bank, they went to their bank because I couldn't. Their bank said, "Oh, we'll buy it at 1.2%." So so what they ended up doing is setting a rate. I think we set it around 0.85% because we said That's more than you're currently earning from your liquid funds, but it's less than the bank is going to charge you. So really what they're gaining is the difference between what they lost on the investment side and what the bank was going to charge them was their gain then. But it's because it was actually this specific case was a 1-year bond. So they had a gain in buying their own bonds. I was able to quantify that. My clients that do 4, 5, 6, 7-year bonds, I wouldn't recommend that they do it. And hopefully, and it's getting a little esoteric and but a little complicated, but hopefully you're following it, and that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution on these answers.
I think this has helped a little bit, and I think we're gonna have to digest some of this. I'm still learning about the bond thing myself. So, you guys have any questions for Bob?
Thank you, it's a good presentation. It was a very good presentation.
Thank you.
I mean, 'cause even I could understand some of that.
After we kind of get through this a little bit, can I email you some follow-up questions?
Yeah, any questions you guys have, something pops in your mind later, just send it over to me. And again, if it's something you want to explore, we can do that, to help you do that. And you have all the way up to like I mentioned, to make that decision before you incur any fees, except for the rating fee if we decide to sell the bonds. Okay?
Thank you for coming down.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
All right, we want to go to the superintendent's report.
Mr. Clark, you didn't have.
Oh, Mr. Clark.
I can wait till the health insurance. That's the only thing I've got.
Okay. I didn't put it on here because I didn't want to pressure you guys to get that done yet or not, but have you guys looked at it?
Yeah, so we had a meeting today. We did a vote online. We had about 20% of our people want to stay with Blue Cross Blue Shield. There's a few issues that you're already sure aware of. Like we've got one teacher that her specialist doctor is not in network and probably won't be in network.
Thank you.
But I was surprised that 20% of the people wanted to stay. I think, and then we only had 78 people last I checked vote of our 188 that are insured. But so that kind of shows me that some people are interested in staying with Blue Cross. But
About a fifth of everybody voted.
right, 100%.
Of course, we don't know, people that did vote don't know care.
Exactly. Yeah, that's another thing. I mean, they probably just said, it's cheaper because they may not use it. So it's really tough to say. But I mean.
So
So
80% of the ones you voted online today,
yes,
and 80% voted to change?
right. And it was less than half the people that voted. So
I've got we're going to try to do a special board meeting if we can all arrange it, because we still have a couple staffing things to take care of in about a week and a half or a week or so. So if anything changes, you want to.
I think some people felt like they didn't want to vote because they didn't have that HRA document, or they didn't want to vote on something that's promised and not in writing, and so they didn't know exactly what they're voting for. Some people told me they
We
wouldn't.
should have that by the end of the week. So
Okay.
I'm hoping for mid-week.
Did they
So-
have any more questions
Oh yeah, there were a lot of questions.
that you didn't know the answer, or?
Yeah, there were. Well, another big drawback, and I don't know exactly, and I don't think it was answered, was the out-of-pocket max for prescriptions. Apparently, we had 250 on tier 1 and then 500 on tier 2. That's what we currently have, and that one doesn't exist.
No, there's not one on the
And
other plan.
I explained how that combined with the copays and deductibles for the out-of-pocket max.
That one, the way I understand that one, if you're taking some serious medication, and you're also going to doctors and stuff, the other one will take care of you, so you're really not going to be up. But it'd be like the person that doesn't have any serious health issues, that's just taking a bunch of medication, that would impact them.
Right. Then also at the meeting, somebody just randomly said, "Hey, is Dr. Oliver covered?" And I'm like, "I'm sure he's part of Baptist Health." And they said, "Well, they've seen 10 different doctors in maybe a hospital or a provider that some are covered and some aren't." And I think that's strange, but so we typed Dr. Oliver on the network provider, and we didn't find him.
Did
So,
you do family physicians?
well, I'm not for sure. So somebody called their office and couldn't get a definitive answer, and I think that's probably one of our most common doctors. So I think
But Dr. Staten is.
exactly. That's what I said. I said Staten is. You would think Oliver would be,
Yeah.
but I couldn't. I said
When they went with Baptist Health, they had to go with Baptist Health. I mean, anytime anytime you go to a hospital and end up having a bunch of anesthesiologists or whatever, you
They're
never
all-
know who's
Right.
tier 1, 2, 3,
Yeah, whose
whatever.
hands are in there, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
but I thought once they signed over with Baptist Health, that was the billing agent.
I thought so too. It made sense to me.
We can ask.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
I figured they'd probably check, because he was on that list that you sent out initially, like I'm sure one of the first names of the most common
Yeah,
names that popped
and
up.
the entire Baptist Health Group came back as in, but,
Right.
you know, I don't know. And there's gonna be some that aren't, like you said. I mean,
Right.
that's part of the deal.
But I would think anything under the Baptist Health umbrella would be covered.
That's the way they presented it the other day, but I'll double check on that one to
Yeah.
make sure.
I think those were the main issues from the meeting.
And I should have that document, I'll just send it to you when we have it. And I'll explain that to you guys here in just a second. It's under the superintendent's report anyway, which is what we're doing, right?
Right. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
So anyway, while he was talking, before we started the meeting tonight, the bill failed that had the compromise in it, 6146. Then they voted while we were in our executive session to override SB1, and that failed 63-45. And then they put the other bill back together and put it before the House, and it passed 73-34 while he was talking on it. So the bill, the funding formula bill has passed the House. It now goes back to the Senate, and if the Senate passes it, it goes to the governor. So that's definitely better than when we started the meeting. We'll see how that works out.
Now, this will go before the Senate when?
They're saying tomorrow, I think. They're all, I think, feeling the pressure, so hope maybe, you know, maybe we'll figure
Do
something
we
out.
know what's in that bill?
Yeah, that was
That
the
other-
original bill they voted on tonight, which was that compromise, which included the $75 million in vouchers and some of the other things they had worked out. So, apparently that wouldn't pass the House. And then they're saying it'll pass the Senate, but we'll see. how
Well,
that
from
goes.
what I read, that really only affects areas that have private schools, like the Chicago area,
Right,
the county
yeah,
area.
in the suburbs.
Suburbs,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah,
And
and that's
we don't-
why a lot of the downstate, I think, were against it,
Mhm.
because it doesn't really have any benefit for it. It's just more tax dollars going somewhere else. I don't know. Either way, it looks like we're getting a little closer to funding. I was told over the weekend not to expect state aid check number 3, regardless of what happens, because they won't get this finalized and the vouchers over to the comptroller. So that means September 10th, we won't get our next state aid payment like we would have, and our payroll's due the 12th. So it's going to be kind of touch and go. If you look at your treasurer's report, we talking about liquidity that he keeps talking about. We've liquefied most of our investments. That bottom line down there, there's still a few left, and we're going through those as fast as we can before we take out a loan, because even though we're losing some of our potential interest that we would get, it's minimal and it's less than what we'd have to pay on the loan, or the tax anticipation loan.
Where, do we know where this $152,883 annually is put, what account that's put in?
Yeah, that's in the debt services fund. And the two bond issues, not the QSEV, but the two bond issues, it comes straight from the tax levy and goes straight into that fund. So it's not part of our state aid.
Okay.
It comes from the property tax levy. It's levied for those bonds and interest on the bonds, and it goes straight into that.
But our debt services was a negative number at the beginning of the month and the end. I guess my question once again is, are we borrowing from either to pay Paul?
No, well, we can't borrow out of the debt services principal part to pay salaries. You can only borrow on extra interest levied, and we did have some extra, so we did borrow some of that, but that was in that account at City National. It wasn't in there. So the reason I think that's negative is because it won't be filled until we get our property taxes back. Because that's done on the property tax levy.
Well, when we get this $152,883 annually and set it aside, does it just keep accumulating in there?
It does until we have to use it. Yeah.
Okay.
And we can only use that on, if it's levied for the principal, the way I understand it, we can only use it on the principal payment. So it sits in that account until we have that principal payment. We have two different payments, one's in December and one's in May or June.
So this right here, the treasurer's report, this is actually how much money we have in all of our accounts.
Yeah, the top part, and then you got the bottom part on investments, yeah. That's what we have right now.
Investments, okay?
And we pulled a little bit more out of our investments because when we made payroll, this past payroll, we had $47,000 left total. So we had to pull a little bit more out of that savings account in case some bills come in, electric bills, et cetera.
Has anyone requested a payment be made for the, work on the
Yes.
primary building?
The first payment request came in, it was for $170,000, I think.
And is there, and
And
have
it
we
should-
paid that?
Should be in there somewhere.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
fine.
it is.
That's fine,
It should be
okay.
in your bills. Right.
It is on page.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who is it?
Yeah, it's everyone. That'll be in that other packet.
Okay.
Okay, so now, this wouldn't be near as complicated, but not only are we waiting on Springfield to figure this out, we're waiting on Massac County also. Our property tax bills, as you know, haven't gone out. They should have by now. That litigation is holding that up. And talked to several people today, and they're hopeful within a couple of weeks the property tax bills will go out. That's definitely something, if they would have went out on time, we would have some money before the next payroll, and we would have been in a lot better shape. So now we'll see when they go out. Eventually, they'll have to go out at some point, so hopefully that'll be settled. And again, that's unfortunate because that lawsuit has nothing to do with us. It's only the Joplin Road District, but it all goes through the county clerk's office. So our bills are held up too.
So has the judge said anything on that yet? I haven't heard.
No, I think they're trying to work out, there was an issue on the current rates for the Joplin Maple Grove districts on the tax levy, or the tax extension, and I think they thought they had it worked out, but I think it's not quite worked out yet. And they don't want to send them out until they get that, I guess, 100% correct. Okay, so what Mr. Clark was talking about, the health insurance update. So far, we've had two major offers. One was with Blue Cross Blue Shield, who we've had for 7 or 8 years now, I can't remember, something like that. Their first offer was a 5.7% increase. You gotta remember it cost, $1.5 million or whatever this year, so that's a significant increase. Their second, when we said no, we have an offer from United Healthcare, they came back with a 2.5 increase. And then the consultant said, no, we have this offer from United Healthcare. They came back with almost 0.5% increase. They never would decrease anything, which is what we were hoping for, obviously. And what Mr. Clark was saying, there are some differences in the two insurance. There's a reason why United Healthcare is cheaper, obviously. So we're not going to pretend like it's the exact same coverage. We feel like it's close. The main comparison that we were looking at, obviously, is what Mr. Clark said. A lot of people probably looked at is the cost. Just from the employee standpoint, they would save, if you have an employee family plan, you would save about $2,000 coming out of your check every year if we switched to United Healthcare because it was such a lower rate. If you have an employee child, obviously you can see there it's about $1,000 and so on. So it's a much cheaper plan, and that's not just savings for the employees, that's savings for the district. If you remember, we pay 60% of the first, or the last 3 plans up there, and we pay 75% of the first plan. So this savings is passed on to us as well, which would only help us with our budget issues. And like I said, there are some differences in coverage, and what Mr. Clark asked about, we don't have in writing yet. I've asked the consultant to get that back to me as soon as he can. But we have an HRA, which is a reimbursement agreement, and that allows us to get cheaper rates for insurance because we have a much higher deductible than what we pass on to the employees. So the employees, their deductibles, what is it, $750?
$750, yes.
Yeah, but the actual deductible is like
$63.50.
yeah, 6,000 or something. So what happens is if Mr. Clark goes to the hospital, he has to pay. It looks like they're charging $6,000 for that deductible because that's the healthcare plan, but then the district reimburses that difference. which allows us to get a cheaper rate and pass that savings on to everyone. So it's really a good thing, because the average person does not meet the deductible every year. You know, the average person's insurance. In fact, it's only about probably 20% that do on any given plan. So it allows us to get a much cheaper rate for everybody, and then still the employees aren't out this huge high deductible because we have this HRA. We've had this, gosh, over 10 years now. So this is something we've been doing for a long time. And what we're talking about doing is altering our HRA because this coverage, there are a couple things that are higher, obviously, it's a cheaper plan. One of them is the copay for specialists. Under the new plan, it would go up to 100. Under the current plan, it's only 40. But with the new plan, a regular doctor in network is 0 copay, and right now our in-network doctor is 20. So we were trying to split the difference there, and so what we were talking about doing is reimbursing them $50 back for that copay. So instead of just going up to $100 copay, which is what the insurance policy is, we would use our HRA to reimburse them back down to 50, which is still $10 more than what they pay now, but they also get a $20 savings if they go to a regular doctor, which you have to go to first before you see a specialist. So you save a little money. The prescription drugs is the one that's the sticking point. I talked to, none of us caught it, I guess. I didn't catch it the other day when we were presenting it. There is a cap, a maximum out of pocket for prescriptions under our current plan, and it's because we've been renewing that same plan for many, many years now. They were telling me that a new Blue Cross Blue Shield plan wouldn't even have that today because the cost, the big cost in an insurance policy these days is prescriptions, apparently, which is a significant factor. But the new plan doesn't have that max. And then also the copay was higher. We've talked about in the HRA making that copay back down to what it is, reimbursing them back down. Even though they would have that initial higher copay, we'd reimburse them for that. And that's what, those are the things that Mr. Clark was saying they'd like to see in writing, which is understandable. Then I also have Mr. Boyer looking at what we could do, if anything, for that out-of-pocket maximum. And we would put that in HR as well if we could figure that out.
That did remind me, pulling this up, one of the last question I had about, that came up, was about the reimbursement schedule. I don't know, it may already be in the HRA now, but some people aren't sure on how long they should expect to get reimbursed.
Yeah, and it's been a little goofy now, probably because of the money situation.
Right.
Normally they're supposed to be that monthly, I think.
Okay.
But it would be in that document. So when I get that to you, it should be in there.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's monthly. Or supposed to be monthly. I know we've gotten behind though. Okay, so anyway, those are the main issues with the health insurance, and that's why, if we can, I would like to have a special meeting another week and a half or so to try to finalize that, because we don't have everything ready yet. But in the end, Aaron, if you'll come back and just make, the contract says you guys have a right to make a recommendation.
Right.
And, you know, whatever that recommendation is, and then the board will have to decide whether we're sticking with Blue Cross or going with United Healthcare. And I'd like to get that done. Because I wasn't aware of this the other day either, Mr. Clark, but the premiums that come out in your check in September pay for the October premiums. I didn't realize that. So that's why I'd like to do that before we do payroll in September. Because if we're going to change, that'll change everything.
Right.
You know? And it'll change anyway, because the rates are going up or going down, one way or the other. So, the last thing, a couple last things, I've talked about enrollment. We look at this every year. I look back on the board agendas, and we typically talk about enrollment in August. This looks a little worse than it is, obviously, because that doesn't go all the way down to 0 on the left. But I wanted to zoom in close enough so you can see. It's still a pretty significant drop over average and a negative trend in our enrollment. I updated this today, so the 265 or 2065 is what we have currently right now. Obviously, we'll probably get a few more in after Labor Day. Labor Day's late, you know, a little bit later. But still, all those other numbers are August 31st. So we're comparing apples to apples there for all the years. And the reason this is important is because even with the new funding formula, some of that's based on how many kids you have. And one of the things they had in there was that hold harmless, which I think they kept in there when they passed that new bill, but to try to account for dropping enrollment, because their argument was if you're not funding it at the level it should be now, when you start dropping, you shouldn't get less because you'll never get up to the adequate level, which makes sense. So hopefully that's still in there. I haven't read all the bill.
I didn't see that part.
And our enrollment has been dropping, and when you look at it, there's a few schools in particular. Jefferson and Unity have been going down steadily, and then the high school had dropped about 50 or so over the last 7 years. So we're losing kids from junior high to high school, and you're only talking about a handful a year, but it's just, that's what's happening. And then those other two schools, Franklin's remaining steady, junior high has kind of had some ups and downs, and then MES is remaining pretty steady. So just something to look at. We'll keep watching that. That's going to be something when we start talking about staffing and things. Obviously, you don't want to be adding staff when you're having fewer and fewer kids, but it all depends on where they're at and how that shakes out. You can't necessarily just get rid of people because you still have a third grade at all these schools or whatever. So even if they're small, we may just have to look at that. But a lot of the kindergarten classes, I think I saw a couple when I was out in the schools, 15, 14. And last year, remember, we had 28, 29. So that we're definitely got a small class this year enrolling. Now the Metropolis Elementary Schools, they were all around 23, 24. That's still not that big though, compared to last year.
September meeting, we'd be able to get the breakdown by class like we used to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I could have probably gave you that today. But,
Well, it's not the end of the month, I figure.
yeah. I was thinking about possibly next Thursday. I didn't know how. I wanted to stay away from the weekend. It's Labor Day weekend, but this next Thursday, somewhere around there, available for a special meeting. We do it at whatever time works best for you guys. I know we still have a couple staffing concerns, and then this insurance thing I would like to wrap up before that payroll, whatever we're going to do.
Sounds
I'll
good to
make
me.
it work. I'll make it work.
Yeah, I'll make
Do you
it
want to do an early one or a normal time? Does anyone have a preference? Larry, you usually like later. But
Oh, like later, but it don't matter anymore.
It's early, I won't be.
let's do it at the normal time then.
6:30.
Can we do it at 6:30 then? Okay. You put that down, Lisa. And that's all I had for the superintendent's report. Next
Park school.
oh yeah, I forgot. I was gonna ask you if you, they're not quite out yet altogether, but I do have the aggregate, and we've talked about, I'd like to get a couple principals in like we used to do, just kind of review those and kind of get back to that if you guys are okay with that.
Good idea.
Probably
Great idea.
next month, we'll have a couple of them come in, and then we can start talking about that. And we also have some other data we need to look at. And I know it may not be the most exciting thing in the world, but it's something I think we all need to be looking at. So I was just going to ask about that.
Okay, and go to the unfinished business. Is there any? None? Okay, let's go to new business. Consideration of minutes. Does everybody have a chance to look over the last minutes, too, that we've had from the special session?
I think we're all caught up on all the minutes.
They're all in here.
I think that covers all.
We also have the treasurer's report and the bills. And I was going to make a special note of item 4 under the consent agenda. This is a new compliance that the board just has to approve under consent agenda. Consent agenda compliance with the salary compensation report pursuant to section 10-20.47 of the Illinois School Code. I believe that's something that just has to be approved under consent agenda.
Okay.
As that's a new report that Debbie has to, I think, send to the state.
So we want to do these one at a time, or you want?
I think you can do them all at once.
Okay, does everybody have a chance to look at the minutes and everything? And the treasurer's report? Consideration of the bills and payroll? And the compliance with the salary compensation report pursuant to the section 10-20-47 of the Illinois School Code. Any discussion on that?
That's the only thing I would discuss is, I don't know what payroll part would be considered. We don't have, we don't get anything on payroll.
Yeah.
There's not anything in the treasurer's report or the.
No.
We don't get payroll.
Nothing.
Yeah, I might have just typed the wrong thing there. I'll check with Debbie. Debbie had to go out of town this weekend because her grandson was turning, had a birthday, so he's not with us tonight. I'll ask on that. That could have been my mistake. I might just put that down when I'm supposed to.
Okay, do I have a motion?
I'll make that motion.
Have a second.
Second.
Any discussion at all, anybody? Okay, roll call please.
Mr. Berger?
Yes.
Ms. Larison?
Yes.
Ms. Rushing?
Yes.
Mr. Summer?
Yes.
Ms. Steele?
Yes.
Mr. Souders?
Yes. Okay, we're gonna move on to the actions from the executive decision. I have, want to entertain a motion to accept the retirement of Rhonda Huckleberry to 2020. Everybody had a chance to look at everything. Is there any discussion on that?
I'll make that motion.
Okay, have a motion, a second?
I'll second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Berger?
Yes.
Ms. Larison?
Yes.
Ms. Rushing?
Yes.
Mr. Summer?
Yes.
Ms. Steele?
Yes.
Mr. Souders?
Yes. Need to entertain a motion for the approval for Mackenzie Doris as a volunteer volleyball coach. Anybody have any discussion or anything?
That's unpaid positions.
That's an unpaid position. Okay, I need a motion, please.
I'll make that motion.
I have a second.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Berger?
Yes.
Ms. Larison?
Yes.
Ms. Rushing?
Yes.
Mr. Summer?
Yes.
Ms. Steele?
Yes.
Mr. Souders?
Yes. I see no other business ahead for us, so do you need a motion to dismiss?
Wait a second. I just wanted to mention that your weekly reports you're sending us
Yes. Are good.
are so good that I feel like I really know what's going on. Thank you very much.
They're a little wordy.
They're a little wordy, but that's all right. I'm a
Well-
wordy person. I'm just like that, so.
I'll get that.
Still move to adjourn.
Yeah, he'll start move to adjourn, but
We had a second and roll call, please.
Mr. Berger? Ms. Larison?
Yes.
Thank you.
Ms. Rushing?
yes,
Mr. Summer?
Yes.
Ms. Steele?
yes.
Mr. Souders?
Yes.
That's good.
We're done.
I started, you know.
I started putting no, it's not adjourned, I'm gonna vote no.
Before they had the-
Oh, boy.
Catherine and Mark.